The boy came running down the ridge like his legs would give out before the news did. His voice cracked in the wind, boots skidding in the snowmelt slush, hands raw from gripping trees on the descent. He burst through the swinging gate of the widow Cleary's porch, mouth frozen open, eyes red. They found him. They found the old man. He's alive. He's in the train. That's how it started. Not the story, but the telling of it, because the mountain already knew. Back up there, halfway between the Devil's Step and the rim of Little Walker's Gulch, the wind doesn't speak in whispers. It gnaws, howls, strips the skin off your knuckles if you dare take off your gloves too long. Men don't go up there past October. The ridge is cursed, they say. No trees on the top, just jagged rocks and black snow. The kind of cold that doesn't just bite, it remembers you. But somebody had seen smoke curling from a broken chimney on what they thought was a boulder. A week ago, a hunter spotted the curl from the lower trail and laughed it off. Damn fool settler built too high. But then the smoke kept coming. Every morning. Steady, thin, like a man trying to live quiet. That's when they remembered the story. The one no one believed, not fully. There'd been talk years ago about a derailed train from the logging company. Winter storm hit fast, track cracked on a bend, whole rear engine tipped sideways into the ridge. No one ever cleared it. No one needed to. Too high, too useless. Timber crews marked it off. Snow swallowed it soon enough. But the old man found it, or maybe he'd always known. They called him Crag. No surname, just Crag like the cliffside he blended into. First time most of the settlers saw him, he was dragging a sled of dried elk hide and stove parts down through the pines into town like he didn't feel the incline. Big as a pine trunk himself. Gray-black beard, patchy, tangled like it tried to escape his face. Eyes like soot, said little, bought what he needed, left before anyone could ask. He wasn't a settler, wasn't part of any claim, but he'd show up every 3-4 months. In the hardest winters, when even the preacher looked scared to light the stove at the church, Crag would come down with meat, fur, tools, salt, and a small pouch of gold flakes, always exact weight. He never looked cold. The children said he slept inside a bear. The loggers said he lived beneath the rocks. The wives said he was a deserter, but no one could explain how he always came down from the high ridges when no one else could survive them. The winter 2 years ago, the year the town lost 5 cabins to drift and freeze, Crag disappeared. No supplies run, no sightings, no smoke. They figured he finally froze in his cave wherever it was, until that smoke started curling again. And now the boy said he was alive, in the train. Not a cave, not a shack, an abandoned, half-buried train wedged in the mountain like God had aimed it there to be forgotten. It took 3 men with snowshoes and a full day's climb to reach it. They had to chop through ice crusts and brush to find the tracks. When they reached the bend, the wind was high and mean, but not a storm. The pine line broke, and there it was. Not just a train. A wall of steel and iron buried in the mountainside. Rusted boxcars fused into snow, black soot frozen on their seams, half the wheels lost to time. But the engine was upright. It leaned into the slope like it belonged there. The smokestack coughed steady puffs. Real fire, real shelter. The men didn't shout, they just looked at each other. And then Crag opened the door. It wasn't a door anymore. It was a slab of reinforced steel with welded hinges made from wagon parts. The hinges didn't creak. It moved smooth. The inside warm. Smelled of wood smoke, oiled metal, dried meat. And Crag, not even surprised, he just stepped back, nodded once, and let them in. They said the walls were lined with thick timber beams, cut, shaped, and slotted like a craftsman's home. Insulated with elk hide, straw, even paper from old telegraph notices. The stove was a modified furnace from the train itself, fed through a fuel system rerouted with copper pipes and melted tin. The man had turned a dead machine into a beating heart. He wasn't sick, he wasn't starving. He looked like a bear in a den, older but alive, quietly defiant. Didn't need company, he said. Didn't mean to cause trouble, I just fixed what was broke. But that wasn't the half of it. When they asked how he survived that long up there, 2 full winters, he pointed to the sidecar. They thought it was wreckage, useless, but he dug it out, hollowed the back. Inside was a root cellar dug straight into the permafrost. He de-insulated it with old seat cushions and rock wool, kept it sealed tight with leather flaps and homemade beeswax seals. Vegetables, smoked meat, even potatoes still firm. He had built vents through the mountain rock for airflow, created a drainage run beneath the caboose. He used snowmelt runoff, filtered through coal, dust, and sand. When the stove burned hot, he redirected heat through the floor using rebent train piping that snaked beneath the iron frame like veins. He didn't just survive, he outbuilt every cabin in the valley. And then someone asked, why a train? He didn't look up from sharpening his knife. "'Cause it was there," he said. "Steel don't rot, and a man needs walls that don't burn." That night the men hiked back with meat, stories, and one clear thought they couldn't shake. They'd built cabins to keep out the cold, but Crag had built something to command it. When word got out, folks didn't know what to do. Some said he was crazy. Others said he ought to be left alone. But a few, quietly, started watching the ridge, watching for smoke, watching for what a man could do if he stopped trying to fight winter and started learning from it. Crag didn't come down again that spring, or that summer. But next winter, when the worst storm in 2 decades hit early and roofs cracked like brittle bones, 3 families followed the trail. They didn't knock, just stood at the bend, waiting, shivering. He let them in. The old train engine didn't groan when it took on weight. It welcomed it. That's what Ruth said later. Ruth Malley, mother of 2 boys, widow 3 winters now. Her cabin down near the river hadn't made it through the first frost. The roof cracked, then the chimney broke clean in half. When the storm came and kept coming, she strapped her youngest boy to her back and pulled the older by hand through knee-high snow toward that smoke in the ridge. It took them nearly 2 days. She was frostbit on both cheeks and her left hand by the time they found the bend. But Crag saw them, not from some high perch, but from inside, behind a small fogged window he'd carved into the steel wall using the old observation glass from the train's sidecar. He opened the slab door and held it. No questions, no sermons, just a nod toward the heat and a hand on her boy's shoulder to guide him in. Inside, the warmth didn't just come from the fire. It was stored somehow. The walls gave off their own low heat. He'd embedded hot stones beneath the flooring, laid out in shallow channels he'd carved with hammer and chisel. Stones he'd warmed for days, rotating them in shifts between the fire basin and the underfloor grid. When the wind howled outside, the cabin train simply hummed in response. The ceiling was draped with thick wool blankets sewn together into an arch, not for looks, for acoustics. It muffled the sound of wind screaming against the steel, gave the children a chance to sleep, gave Ruth the feeling, for the first time in 3 winters, that she was not dying slower by the hour. Crag offered no apologies, just water, hot broth, and silence. The boys took to watching him fix things. He had a workbench inside the gutted furnace room, tools older than anyone had seen. A drawknife, a broken lathe rebuilt using the train's handbrake wheel, saws sharpened to a gleam. Every spare part had a purpose. That was when they started understanding. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a man holed up in a steel box hoping winter would forget him. This was architecture born from obsession and solitude, a kind of learned reverence, not madness. He had listened to the mountain longer than any of them had dared to, and he'd built something that answered it. But there were things Ruth didn't understand right away, like the quiet bell that rang every hour softly from the old conductor's room, or the string of lanterns outside the train, hanging from carved pine poles buried in the snow, flickering in a pattern like signals. She found out that second night. A knock came, not on the door on the side of the train, just beneath the 3rd window, 2 sharp taps. Pause, then one long drag of a knuckle. Crag stood, put on his thick hide coat, and opened a side hatch he hadn't seen before, near the old coal bin. Two shapes stumbled in. A man and a girl, both shaking, skin cracked from windburn. The man's leg was wrapped in blood-stained flannel. The girl was dragging half a sled with nothing but dried beans and 3 lopsided snowshoes. "Collins," Crag said, like greeting an echo. He pointed them toward the warmth, no more words than that. They took the far corner where a cot had been set up already. Blankets there, bandages, a salve that stung like fire but sealed the skin like wax. That's when Ruth understood this wasn't a miracle they'd stumbled into. This was a system, a machine not just of iron and gears but of refuge. Crag had designed it to receive the desperate. He never said so, but the extra bedding, the rotating stew pot, the second latrine chute, all of it pointed to something deeper than survival. He'd planned for people. More came. A pair of twins from the canyon who tried to make it on goat meat and pine nuts. An old ex-scout who'd burned through his last cords of wood before January. A girl no older than 15 who never said a word, just helped tend the fire and kept her hands moving so they didn't shake. The train filled, not crowded but alive. The space had been carved out for it. Where seats once were, there were compartments lined with cedar bark and fox pelt. The observation deck had been turned into a drying room. Hooks and wires hung in a grid overhead for clothes, meat, herbs, even ice blocks. He never asked names. He never took questions. But every night before he turned in, Crag checked the roof vents, climbed the back hatch to clear snow from the exhaust, cleaned the soot plates, readjusted the copper piping by hand to make sure airflow didn't stall. Once Ruth asked why he did it alone, why he didn't let others help with the vent work. He just looked at her and said, "If it goes wrong, I want to be the one outside." By the 3rd week, the children had memorized the pattern of the stove's chuff. They could tell when it needed fuel by the tone. The older men had taken to building small additions outside, temporary lean-tos for wood storage, snow break walls. Crag didn't stop them. He let the place grow like a second skin. But not everyone approved. When the storm broke one morning and let through a window of sun, a few of the guests decided to leave. Said they'd return to their cabins or what was left of them. One man, Thomas Hale, said the train was unnatural. "It ain't right," he said, "living in a dead machine like it's a womb." Crag didn't argue. He opened the hatch, pointed to the trail, and handed Hale a wrapped bundle of dried meat and a compass. No anger, just clarity. But Hale never made it back. They found his body in the spring, 4 miles off the trail, frozen mid-step with the compass still in his hand. That was when the rest stopped talking about leaving. Because by then, they'd all seen what happened when the stove failed for even half a night. It was during the second wave of snowfall, a week of unbroken gray and wind like nails in the skin. The exhaust vent iced over. Crag was out checking the line when the pipe cracked from pressure. The stove sputtered. Inside, temperature dropped like a stone. Frost crawled the walls in minutes. He burst in, chest heaving, arms raw from climbing the ice without gloves. Didn't speak, just threw open the floor hatch, rerouted the heat manually. His hands blistered. Ruth caught the scent of burned skin before the warmth returned. He spent the night with his hands in snow water. Didn't complain. Didn't let anyone tend to him, just said, "The stove lives or we don't." After that, no one questioned the system. Spring came late. The snow melted like it didn't want to leave. When the trail finally opened again, 2 of the men who'd stayed went down to town for supplies. They returned with more than flour and bullets. They brought stories. The town had changed. Word of the train shelter had spread. Some believed it, others mocked it, but no one denied the facts. No one from Crag's Ridge had died that winter. Not one. And in the valley, 5 cabins lost. 2 families buried before February. A preacher came up. Wanted to speak to Crag about the morality of retreating from God's natural order. Crag pointed to the stove and said, "You want to talk to something divine? That's the only altar I kneel to in winter." The preacher didn't stay long. But Ruth did. By summer, the train cabin had become something else entirely. Not a hermit's den, not a refugee hole, a place of learning, a proof of concept. People came not to gawk, but to study. Crag never claimed to be a teacher, but they learned anyway, about airflow, about heat retention, about the physics of snow and sound and stone, about humility. Because a man who could build a sanctuary from a dead machine didn't need to shout to be heard. He just needed to survive where no one else could. By the time autumn rolled around again, the train had stopped being a secret. Crag hadn't invited the world in, but he'd stopped locking it out. Word had drifted across more than just the valley. Men from the next territory came to see it. Not settlers or drifters, but engineers, loggers with drafts and blueprints, surveyors who squinted at the rivets like they might crack the code of how the thing still stood. None of them understood it fully. They called it luck or accidental genius. But Crag had no patience for men who only measured with rulers and never asked what the wind felt like when it turned on a man in the dark. Still, he let them look. He even answered questions when they weren't stupid. And that's when things started to change. That fall, the town held its first gathering in months, a harvest meet in the church's side hall. The benches were full of new faces, young couples from over the ridge, trappers from 3 counties away, even a mayor's son from the east with ink-stained hands and soft boots. The topic on everyone's tongue, the winter shelter in the mountain train. Some wanted to replicate it. Others wanted to take it apart and bring it to town. The mayor's son floated the idea of building a new town depot inside the old rail, lay tracks to it again, make it a warming post for timber crews and surveyors. Crag wasn't at that meeting, but Ruth was. She stood when the young man with the ink-stained boots said Crag had no claim to the land, that technically the company still owned the track and the engine, and that it might be better put to use, serving more than just one man's solitude. And she said plain and quiet, "That train saved 12 lives last winter. Yours wasn't one of them." Silence after that. Even the preacher didn't speak. But the seed had been planted. A week later, a rider came up the ridge with a letter for Crag, from the company. It was polite, but it wasn't a request. They asked him to vacate the premises, cited property rights, structural safety, liabilities. He didn't answer it. But he did do something no one had seen before. He took the brass nameplate from the engine, still half covered in soot, the letters TANNERS Creek Logging and Freight Co., barely legible, and melted it down in the stove. Poured it into a mold he'd carved weeks before. When it cooled, he pulled it out and nailed it to the wall by the stove. A small plaque, barely wider than a man's hand. It read, "No man's shelter, all welcome who respect it." That was the only sign, the only law. And somehow it held. That winter was worse than the last. The cold came down like a god's judgment. Animals vanished. The river froze before November. Even the chimneys in town smoked sideways in the wind like they wanted to flee. People remembered. They didn't ask permission. Families began arriving one by one, some knocking, some just waiting outside. Crag never turned them away, but he made them work, not in words but by example. You eat, you carry wood. You warm your feet, you clean the flues. You share the heat, you help hold it. Ruth kept records that year. At the peak of the storm season, 26 souls lived in that train. 2 babies were born in the conductor's room, now turned infirmary. One old man died, peacefully, under furs, with his boots still warm and the smell of pine pitch on his hands. There were rules, but none spoken. People learned to listen. Learned not to talk over the stove's breathing, not to slam the iron door, not to throw wet logs into the flame. You respected the system, or you left. No one left. There were moments of tension. A young man tried to bring liquor in. Crag caught the scent before the cork came off. He walked over, took the bottle, and without a word, opened the hatch and hurled it into the snow. The glass shattered, the sound thin and final. The man didn't protest. Another night, two brothers argued over who had hoarded extra meat. Voices raised, fists curled. Crag stood, walked between them, and put one hand on each chest. He said, "This train is made of steel, but it don't forgive fire inside it." The meaning landed. The brothers slept on opposite ends that night, but they both helped rebuild the snowbreak wall the next morning. What outsiders couldn't understand was that the train worked because it wasn't just a shelter. It was an agreement. Steel couldn't flex like wood, but it could hold. And Crag had taken that truth and built not just warmth, but order. He'd reinforced the joists with oak salvaged from a sunken barn, built a double-chamber stove with redirected ducting, dug vents into the mountain that took warm air down first, let it rise slow. Every inch of the place had been earned, hammered, bent into place with hands that bled. And people felt that. They treated it like something sacred, even if no one said it aloud. That's why, when the men from the company finally did come up the ridge, with legal papers and 3 armed escorts, they didn't get the reception they expected. They knocked. Crag opened the slab door, didn't let them in, just stood there, arms crossed over a patched hide coat, eyes black as stone. The man in charge read the claim aloud. Crag listened. When it was over, he nodded once, then stepped aside. "Come see what you're evicting." They hesitated but went in. What they saw wasn't a hermit's junk pile. It was a living, breathing shelter. Women stirring stew over an efficient furnace. Children reading from tattered books in a nook with insulated walls. A floor that didn't creak. A ceiling that didn't drip. Warmth that didn't beg for attention. It simply existed calmly, like a living presence. The lead man said nothing for a long time. Then he asked, "How did you?" Crag just looked at the stove. Steel don't rot, wind don't lie, rest is time and blood. The company never came back. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the look in the children's eyes. Or maybe they realized that a thing built this well, by one man, by hand, was beyond ownership. That spring, Ruth and 3 others stayed behind, not just to thank him, but to learn. Crag didn't teach in lessons. He taught in days. You wanted to know how to build a smoke diverter. You helped him dig 6 feet through frozen ground. Wanted to learn heat flow ratios. You carried piping through the mountain, bent it with fire, sealed it with pine pitch and lye. One man broke a fingernail and cursed loud. Crag handed him a rag and said, "Good. Now you'll remember not to put your weight wrong." It was hard, brutal at times, but every person who stayed learned why the train survived. Because it wasn't built for comfort, it was built to endure. Late that spring, a girl, maybe 15, quiet, hands always moving, stood with Crag on the back platform and asked him if he ever planned to leave. He didn't answer for a while. Then he looked at the ridge, the pine line, the mountain shadows long and deep across the snowmelt. "I already did," he said. "Left everything down there behind. This ain't hiding. This is where a man starts over." The train didn't groan. It never did. But it breathed. Steel and wood and fire, holding back the cold not just with walls but with memory. Every burn mark in the stove, every patch of hide on the wall, every seam where a child's hand stitched 2 blankets into one, proof that something better had been built here. Not perfect, but possible. The 3rd winter tested every inch of steel in that train. It came down early and hard, blinding snowstorms with no gaps, no soft days between. The trees bowed under ice so thick it made the pine needles clink together like wind chimes made of bone. The river didn't freeze smooth. It rose in jagged chunks like cracked teeth, surged once in a bitter flood, and then locked solid. Crag didn't fight it. He said only, "If you build it, it's yours, but remember, steel holds, ego don't." Ruth called that the first lesson. By the end of March, they had plans for 2 new shelters, one for the far ridge, one for the canyon base where snow piled less deep, not just copies but descendants. Ruth kept the boys in line. Crag oversaw the welding. The girl with quiet hands, her name was Junie, built a stove nearly as good as his. They said when he first lit it, he smiled, a real smile, first anyone had seen. And so the train didn't die. It became more than a shelter, more than a man's solitude. It became the spine of a movement that had no name, no flag, no doctrine, just this: build strong, share heat, respect the wind, don't hoard, don't shout, listen to the steel. And when the snow comes, and it will come, you'll have a place that breathes. By the 4th year, the train no longer belonged to just one man. That much was clear even to Crag. He didn't fight it, though he never claimed ownership in the first place. He kept to his duties, maintaining the vents, checking the heat cycles, fixing what few parts still dared to break, but he didn't try to slow what was happening. He'd built the shelter to hold off death, not history. And now history was slipping in anyway, one bootprint at a time. They called it Crag's train, though he never did. The younger folks who passed through, travelers, outlanders, railmen with bad luck, some of them thought the name was literal, like the mountain man on the rusted shell. But those who stayed long enough, who dug ditches through frozen soil or cleaned the soot from the chimney hands first, they knew better. They knew it wasn't a nameplate or a title. It was a reminder. That train had only survived because Crag refused to own it. He just listened to it. By midsummer, 3 separate shelters had been completed, not up on the high ridge that was sacred ground, but on lower trails tucked beneath overhangs and built from other derelict freight cars and salvaged steel. They weren't as perfect. Not yet, but they breathed. That was the measure now. Could it breathe? Could it hold heat and silence and life all at once? And when the 5th winter came, the train held again. No one doubted it would. But what no one expected, not even Ruth, was how many people showed up. They came from 3 counties, on foot, on makeshift sleds. One family drove 2 oxen pulling a cart of nothing but burlap and bundled firewood. They came because they knew it wasn't a myth, because someone had been through the ridge last spring and seen it. The girl named Junie had spoken of it while trading mushrooms for seeds in the lowlands. A preacher in a collapsing river town had mentioned it during a sermon. The story had grown wings, not wild ones, not tall tales, just true enough to feel like salvation. People showed up with skills this time. One woman had been a blacksmith's apprentice before her forge froze over. Another had trained under a telegraph repairman. A man in his 50s brought blueprints he'd salvaged from a railroad station fire, rolled and brittle, but whole. A boy of 9 knew how to set traps so clean he could catch rabbits without bruising their meat. And they didn't come to stay in Crag's train. They came to build more. That winter it wasn't just survival, it was expansion. The original train remained the heart. Crag still slept in the front compartment near the stove. Ruth ran the operations like a general. Every day had rotation charts. Every meal had assignments. The latrines were now piped, insulated, vented. Junie had done that. Crag just raised his eyebrows once when he saw the design. Didn't think of that, he admitted. She beamed for 3 days. Snow came harder that year. The wind didn't howl, it screamed. Trees didn't sway, they fell, but none of the new shelters failed. Not one. Because they were built with Crag's rules. No hoarding, no shortcuts, and no pride louder than the stove's breath. By midwinter, the population had grown to nearly 60 across the 3 main shelters and 2 satellite outposts. Communication ran on a bell-end signal system Ruth devised using old copper wire and salvaged door knockers. 1 ring every hour meant all was well. 2 meant prepare for movement. 3 was distress. It rarely rang more than 1. But then one night in late February, It rang 3. Not from inside the shelter, from outside. A man had collapsed near the trail fork, 300 yards from the main hatch. His hand was frostbitten, his boots frozen to his feet. A child's coat was tied around his waist. He'd carried a bundle wrapped in furs. Ruth ran out with 2 others. They found him delirious, barely breathing, barely holding onto the bundle. Inside it was a baby. No more than 4 months old, face blue at the edges but breathing. They brought them in. Crag took the man's coat. Ruth took the child. Others prepped a hot cloth station and dug out the last of the goat milk powder. The man didn't speak for hours, just sat by the fire, hands in his lap, as if waiting for judgment. When he did speak, it was just 4 words. No cabin left, burned. He hadn't come for shelter, he'd come for the child. I knew you'd take her, he said to no one in particular. Then he wept, not loud, not messy, just the kind of weeping that a man does when he's already empty and the silence finally takes notice. The baby lived. Crag carved her a cradle out of a discarded seat bench. Ruth lined it with fox fur. They named her Ember. Not symbolic, just honest. That moment, that rescue, became something of a turning point. Until then, the train shelter had been a story of survival, proof that one man's grit could carve warmth into the bones of a dead machine. But after Ember, it became more. It became a mission. Because the truth had settled in, this was going to happen again. Winters weren't easing, they were coming harder, faster. Timber towns were shrinking, families were scattering. The old ways, single-family cabins, far-flung homesteads weren't holding up anymore. People needed systems, shared heat, shared walls, shared air that moved the way Crag had taught them to listen for. So that spring, they started mapping. Not just the ridge, but the whole valley, the river paths, the floodplains, the abandoned tracks. Crag pulled out a stub of charcoal and added lines to their crude paper map. Junie drew notations for elevation. The trapper boy marked wildlife paths. Ruth added symbols for wind exposure and sunlight. They planned 5 new shelters. They knew they might not finish them all before the next freeze, but they had to start. Crag didn't speak much during these sessions, but he was always nearby, sanding down beams, rewelding old pipe, refitting stove grates. He taught without speaking now, just by being. And the people, those 60 hardened, soot-streaked, wind-burned survivors, they followed. One night as the thaw began, Ruth stood beside Crag on the observation deck and asked him, finally, "Why the train? You could have built a cabin like anyone else." He looked out at the black treetops, the slope leading down to the new shelters being framed in the mud. "Because a train knows how to carry people," he said, even after it stopped moving. That was the closest he ever came to poetry. He never wrote anything down, never called himself a builder or a founder. But when he passed, quietly in his sleep the following year, with his boots by the door and the stove still warm, the people didn't cry loudly. They lit lanterns, dozens, and placed them along the trail. Every 10 yards, all the way down to the lower path. Not for mourning, for guidance, so that others would see the light, would find their way up the ridge, past the wind, past the trees, to the place where steel and silence still breathed. They didn't bury him. He wouldn't have wanted that. They placed his body in the oldest sidecar, the one he'd first repaired, sealed it with wax and wrapped him in the same wool he'd used to mute the ceiling sounds that first winter. And then they sealed the car shut, not as a tomb, as a wall. The new shelter was built around it. His body holds one end of the beamline where the wind hits hardest, just like he would have wanted. The stove still breathes, the train still stands. And every time a new soul comes up the ridge, face cracked from wind, breath ragged from the climb, the door opens. No questions, just heat. and the knowledge that they were not the first to crawl through the cold and find salvation not in miracles, but in steel, smoke, and the stubborn hands of a man who once looked at a dead machine and said, "I can make this live."